I asked for your most unpopular knitting opinions and boy did you deliver. So in this video I'll add my comments to your hot takes. True or not true? Let's find out. Hot take number 1. So, hand-dyed yarns look gorgeous on a hang, but I always find them disappointing when knit up. And judging by how many upvotes this has gotten, well, it sure seems to be a popular opinion rather than an unpopular opinion. And I would definitely agree to some extent. A lot of colorways just don't work out. And I guess this is why it's so important to foster a relationship with a dyer in your area, where you can actually touch the yarn, see it in person. Maybe they have some swatches or even a real project you can take a look at. Maybe they even do custom dyes specifically tailored to your needs and your project. And then when you find someone you like, stick to them. And don't just buy yarn from yet another new indie yarn dyer just because there is a new, limited collection drop, a Black Friday sale, or a yarn festival, because this is where the mistakes are happening. A year ago I've knitted this sweater here, and I would say it's such a great colorway with well-planned speckles. I mean, not everyone likes speckles, but if you do, this is as good as it gets because there is no color pooling, you don't see any transitions between skeins and so on. But I know for a fact that the dyer uses his own yarn to knit sweaters just like this one. You can see it on his Instagram. And it's not really a big surprise that this turned out precisely the way I planned it because I did my research. If there is no swatch or project, I'm not gonna buy it. I mean, sorry, I know what knitting swatches means for the dyer, but for me that is the hard rule. No swatch, no business. It's my firm belief that colorways need to be planned with a specific project in mind. And sometimes they are, and often they actually aren't. But the color distribution needs to be adjusted depending on how short or wide your rows or rounds are, because this will define the frequency of those color changes, of those stripes, those speckles or whatnot. And you need to find a dyer that A, truly understands that, and B, you need to pick a colorway with a specific project in mind. Otherwise, you just end up with clown barf. You can't just buy a colorway and then knit whatever with it. That just doesn't work. Do you agree or disagree? Comment below. So here's hot take number 2. Designers often use expensive yarn or yarn held double, and it can be hard to work out a more cost-effective alternative. Now, before I even comment on that, let's drop the link. yarnsub.com can be a great resource for finding alternatives. So simply enter the yarn and it spits out alternatives that you can use to achieve a similar gauge and drape. Secondly, a lot of manufacturers actually have their own pattern library. Back in the day, some yarn labels came with patterns. You could find it on the inside or so. These days, I've seen QR codes on some yarns. So if you have a favorite affordable yarn, then I would definitely check out the website of the manufacturer, or maybe any publication they are sponsoring, because this can be a great way to find patterns that actually use affordable yarns. Other than that, I will say it's true. A lot of patterns use expensive yarn. Now more than ever, because yarn has become quite expensive in the last 2 decades due to inflation or lately extreme fluctuations in the forex exchange rates, or the much higher overhead costs an indie yarn dyer has compared to a larger corporation. But also please take my example. I am hypersensitive, so if the yarn is scratchy, I honestly do not want to knit with it. On top of that, I'm a process knitter, so being able to work with a special yarn makes the whole process even more rewarding. If I need to pour 40 hours into creating a sweater, I don't want to spend 2,400 minutes cursing the itchy yarn. On top of that, I personally earn so little money with my patterns that most of the times, for me, a pattern is only an afterthought. Here, this shawl, for example, I've knitted it for myself, and then I published a pattern, and I don't know, in 3 years probably earned $1,000 or so, before taxes and expenses and whatnot. I'd have to restructure my whole business for it to become viable. And even then, it would be a hard stretch. And I assume it's very similar for a lot of other people who publish patterns. As a result, a pattern is often full of selfish choices because basically it is a selfish choice. Hot take number 3. Have as many VIPs, work in progress, as you want, unless it's stressing you out. And there isn't any obligation to finish a VIP unless someone is paying you to do it. I would say true. As always, it's your hobby and you define what brings you joy. I will say that coming back to a project after a while brings certain challenges. So first of all, you need to find your place in the pattern again. It's very easy to remedy if you always stop knitting at a memorable place and make it a habit to add notes to your pattern. Which row or round did you stop? Which changes did you make? Or maybe even note which mistakes you didn't bother to fix or you still need to fix. Some people, or a lot of people, use Ravelry to document their projects, and this can be especially helpful if you come back 2 years later and want to knit the same project one more time. And please write more and not less, because 3 years later you won't remember that you went down a needle size for the hem or something like that, and now as you continue you need to go up one needle size again. Of course, you also always need to secure your work so stitches can't drop and moths can't eat it. So use needle stoppers, use project bags, put your project in a plastic tub where humidity or pests can't ruin it if that is an issue in your area. Secure the ends of your skeins with hair clips and so on so they don't tangle up. All this is very, very important, but there are 2 other things I will highlight here. First of all, your attention will change with time. So if you come to a project a year or 2 years later, this might be quite noticeable to a point where you will have to unravel. You used to be a tight knitter and now you knit a lot more loosely, so your gauge changed, so often you will have to unravel, and that's why it's often not a smart idea to park those work in progresses a long time. Secondly, if stitches are too long on the needle, the weight of those needles and any force you apply will affect the last row that you've worked, because the last stitches are still connected to the working yarn. So if you apply force, it can draw more yarn from the ball. Thus your stitches get larger, so as a result you can have single or multiple loose stitches at the beginning of the row or complete rowing out. So consider, before you continue, consider tinking one row or a couple of stitches to avoid these problems. And then of course, if you just start new projects and never finish old ones, and you are actually not a process knitter and you want to wear those projects, I think you should consider working on a system that gradually lets you reduce those UFOs, unfinished objects. Start small and turn an otherwise overwhelming task into bite-sized problems. Don't think, okay, I still need to finish that sweater I started 2 years ago. Rather think, okay, this week I'm gonna knit 2 or 3 rows, just 2 or 3 rows, and then turn this into a habit. Find the smallest little step you are actually willing to take, and maybe even find yourself a UFO buddy, so you can encourage each other and hold each other accountable. Some people do this each January and sort of use this as a knitting spring cleaning and finish all those unfinished objects, and those they couldn't unfinish, they just unravel. But yeah, there is no knitting police, so if you have 20 VIPs and you are fine with that, then really, it's fine. Here is the next hot take. Continental knitting is not better than English style. Some continental knitters seem to be obsessed with having to tell English style knitters they must change. True. If you have been following me for a while, you probably already know my take here. There is no knitting style that is inherently better than any other. There are millions of people who knit continental style, millions who throw English style, millions of Eastern knitter, and so on. So if you say things like combination knitting sucks, or combination knitting is the best style ever and you need to change, you are in a way insulting all those millions of proficient knitters who are perfectly fine with their style and see nothing wrong with it. I will say that there are two important variables here. So first of all, we all have different bodies, and those bodies might have a different history on top of that. Not everyone is as nimble, some might have injuries, illness and whatnot. So while continental knitting might not be the best or fastest style on this planet, it can be the best for you. If you take a close look at any style, you will notice that it puts the stress on different parts of your body. With some, your left wrist does more work. With others, it's the right wrist. Some move the fingers a lot, others don't. If you carefully analyze the limits of your body, you might just find the best style for you. And I think it's great that the internet actually gives you this possibility to change that. Because when I grew up, quite frankly, nobody asked me which style I wanted to learn. It was literally either continental style or get a bad mark in primary school from my crafts teacher. Those were my choices. Secondly, I think it's important to realize that different styles are better at different things, and often they were developed and optimized alongside a specific range of projects. So take lever knitting, for example, where you use very long needles and stabilize them underneath your armpits or against a knitting belt or sheet. That takes a lot of stress away from your joints. And it can be awesome to knit stockinette stitch, Vereil patterns, things like that. Super fast, super ergonomic. But the second you have to purl 2 stitches together through the back loop, you will run into major problems. Or when you want to knit a small diameter project with double pointed knitting needles, then this just doesn't work anymore. And I do think it's vital to know the strong and weak points of any style. I like complicated patterns. In my hometown, traditional patterns use a lot of twisted stitches on very fine needles, often socks, things like that. Combination knitting simply wouldn't make any sense in that context because I actually want those twisted stitches, nor would any style with a tensioning method that is a little bit too closed. I need that flexibility in my fingers for those complicated stitches. But that is me, my body and my preferences and not yours. And if you analyze your body and your knitting preferences, you can find a style that is uniquely suitable for you. I received many comments regarding patterns and the way they are written. For example, here someone complains about the need for hand holding through every pattern, or someone else wrote, you don't learn anything because you've essentially painted numbers through the whole thing. And I am having problems with this hot take. Let me explain. The reason why I am sitting here today teaching you how to knit is that when I was younger, I couldn't find any patterns for the things I wanted to knit. While I will admit that designing my own patterns has taught me a lot, there was, by its sheer nature, a lot of trial and error involved. A lot of frustrating moments, a lot of projects that I've basically knitted for the trash bin. While I entirely agree that learning how to adjust patterns, how to construct your own patterns from scratch is vital, it is also a skill that needs to be taught. But who does the teaching? You, me, nobody? Or is it the detailed pattern? Also, I think there are things you can discover for yourself. For example, you have a raglan sweater pattern. Through a bit of frogging, you can knit it a size larger. But I don't think anyone without prior experience will on a whim decide to add short rows to raise the neck, or to add bust dots, or deconstruct the whole thing to knit it flat and turn it into a seamed design. Those are big leaps, and these need to be shown to you. And sometimes I feel that some of the people complaining about modern patterns holding your hands too much forget about the long and arduous journey they were on until they came to the point where all this spoon feeding feels a little bit annoying or too convoluted. And we shouldn't forget that in like ages past, like 100 years ago, 50 years ago even, a lot of people learned knitting in a social context, in school, from their mother, from their grandmother, from their aunt, or maybe their uncle, who knows. And so there was always someone sitting next to them who could correct their mistakes, as the people they could copy. These days, a lot of people sit alone in front of their computer and need to learn everything from the rare tutorial that shows how to knit this pattern, or from the pattern. And secondly, maybe you forget all the people that gave up on knitting because the frustration was too big. So if you are an experienced knitter, it should be easy, maybe annoying, but easy to ignore all the additional information you do not need. If you are a beginner, however, you cannot simply add that information. Here is another unpopular opinion. Double-pointed knitting needles are a matter of the right mindset. If you listen to everyone telling you it's hard, then it's hard. But if you give it a try with confidence, it's no more challenging than learning to work with straight needles. I need to answer this hot take with another one. The worst advice I get all the time is I should use double points instead of using circulars. Double points just make no sense to me. Putting it down and picking it up drives me nuts, and I always mess it up. My stance here is actually very clear. Again, we have all different bodies. Our hands are definitely not all the same size. Yet, if you want to knit the same socks with the same yarn, the actual project will be the exact same size. So with that in mind, it would be ridiculous to think that the same tool works just as well for every knitter. And that's setting aside differences in dexterity or preferences. So I firmly believe that there are some knitters that do better with magic loop and some with double-pointed knitting needles. I will say that a lot of knitters probably learned knitting on straight single-pointed knitting needles, and then maybe they wanted to knit a larger project and bought some circulars but to knit flat. So from that point of view, using the magic loop technique to knit in the round cannot not feel more familiar compared with juggling around 5 double-pointed knitting needles. So the learning curve has to be steeper for double-pointed knitting needles, and it's something you actively need to work on, and not just throw those double-pointed knitting needles into the corner after giving it a try for 15 minutes. Especially because I always say the first 2 rounds knitting on double-pointed knitting needles are always the most awkward. After that, you have fabric that will stabilize the whole contraption and it gets very easy. But those first rounds, you need to push through. It's a bit like this beautiful panorama walk that starts with steep stairs. So I guess partially it is a little bit about the mindset. Most importantly, I would use this opportunity to instill the thought that both techniques have their pros and cons. So I love double-pointed knitting needles. I hate pulling through that cable. But the second I need to knit Fair Isle in the round, I will instantly switch to the traveling magic loop technique, because managing those floats across the gaps of double-pointed knitting needles is just such a pain. However, if I need to knit gloves, here the fingers of gloves, and I have, 14 stitches on my needles, I will always knit that with double-pointed knitting needles, because pulling that long cable through that few stitches is a fiddly nightmare, and it needlessly stretches out those stitches. So I feel that as an experienced knitter, you kind of have to force yourself to use both. Maybe in 90% of all cases you use the magic loop technique, but acknowledge that in 10% of all cases, double-pointed knitting needles have the potential to yield better results and vice versa. Here is another unpopular opinion that got surprisingly many upvotes. So here, I love to purl. People make way too big a deal of it. It's part of knitting. I think I purl faster than I knit. And here I would say, be careful. Do I mind purling? No. Can I purl almost as fast as I knit? Sure. Can I purl blindly? Yes. Do I believe it's a matter of practice? Definitely. But that fact does not invalidate the millions of people who have major problems with purling. I remember when I tried to learn how to purl, I just couldn't do it the way it was shown to me, and that's when I came up with letting my middle finger push the yarn forward to make the process easier, only to learn years and years later that others came up with the same technique independently. Also remember that from a geometrical point of view, knit and purl stitches are mirrored. So a purl stitch is actually trying to achieve a knit stitch from the wrong side, while your yarn is actually tensioned in the wrong direction. So no matter your style, no matter the way you tension your yarn, one of the two stitches has to be awkward. Combination knitting famously kinda tries to circumvent the problem, but even there you have to enter the knit stitches through the back loop, which arguably is still a little bit more difficult. And the second you actually need to produce twisted stitches, you are back to square one. So again, I really want to stress, just because something is easy for you doesn't invalidate the issues other people are having. I mean, you don't walk up to a disabled person sitting in their wheelchair saying, walking is so easy, stop fussing around, just get going. I mean, I know a somewhat crass example, but in many ways our bodies, our brains work differently, and I feel it's very important to acknowledge that. I mean, on the other side of the picture, if you want to become a master knitter, I kind of expect you to fight through that and practice until purling becomes easy. It will be a long journey, but at one point you probably will look back and ask yourself, what is it that you found difficult about purling? But some actually never get there, and that too is okay. Here is another good one. I really like knitting swatches compared to I never knit swatches. I am definitely team knitting swatches. Do I enjoy them? No. But a swatch will give me the opportunity to practice the stitch pattern. It will show me if my color choices work out, if the yarn works well with the pattern. It will show me how the project will behave after washing. Plus, I can use it to try out different cast-ons or bind-offs, and if the or selvage stitches. And if your project needs to be sticked, blocked, seamed, or embroidered, you have a nice practice piece where nothing happens if you mess up. So for me, a swatch is really not about getting gauged. That's an afterthought. It's a tool to prevent costly mistakes. Also, there's a reason why the majority of experienced knitters will tell you to knit one. Don't ignore that. They know their stuff. And I will say that some super experienced knitters will insist that they never knit swatches, but you have to question that very carefully. So some of them knit only with a handful of different yarn bases and always the same patterns. And after 20 years, they acquired so much experience that they don't need it anymore. And if you only knit shawls or the same Fair Isle socks, there comes a point where that swatch won't be able to answer any of your questions anymore. But if you are knitting your first pair, then you need those answers. Another thing I observe is that some knitters prefer an oversized boxy fit, maybe even with drop shoulders or something like that. And if your sweater ends up having 10 instead of 7 or 8 centimeters of positive ease, that's really no big deal breaker, especially if it's a larger size. You probably won't even notice it. But if you prefer a fitted sweater, it will matter. And I feel it's very important to acknowledge the differences and acknowledge the different preferences. Here is another hot take that received quite a lot of upvotes. Most patterns are not well written, or someone else also said, just because knitting designers are famous does not mean their patterns are foolproof. And you know what? I would say, yes, absolutely true. I would even go as far as including my own patterns. But here, beyond those facts, here's the deal. If I sell a pattern for $6 US, I can count myself lucky if that results in $3 to $4 US of a net profit. And that is before income tax. It's incredibly difficult to earn money with patterns. And if you want to be size inclusive, if you want your pattern to work for vision impaired people, screen readers, if you want your pattern to be available in more than one language, maybe you want a diverse range of models showcasing your samples, etc., then you will quickly come to a point where the costs of producing the pattern are higher than the opportunity costs, and you're better off flipping burgers next door. So at one point, as a designer, you always have to find a compromise. Setting that aside, please think about it. What actually defines a good pattern? I mean, sure, it should be tech edited and test knitted. It's easy to verify this. Go to Ravelry, check out the pattern, check out past projects. Always do this before you start with a new pattern to avoid unpleasant surprises. But other than that, think about it. There are people who complain that there are not enough pictures included from all different angles. There are those who complain that the pattern is 10 pages long and uses too much ink when printed out. There are those who complain that the single steps are not explained well enough, while others want everything to fit on one page. Some prefer a nice, lofty layout, while others want it to be screen reader friendly. Some expect a video tutorial to go along with it, and as you've seen, some complain about too much hand-holding. And I think that you as a consumer kind of need to figure out which designer works for you and which doesn't. This will require a little bit of trial and error, but then, just like with good yarn, you need to stick to these people. And thankfully, a lot of designers offer free patterns. Download them, check if this works out for you, and then stick to these people. I also feel that we need to acknowledge that a lot of patterns come from essentially one-woman shows. So yes, 4 eyes are better than 2 and 10 eyes are yet better than 4. But a lot of these designers just have their own set of eyes. They can't afford a tech editor because that costs money. A test knit also costs time and money. They can't afford that. But I think we should also consider what we gain by having so many independent voices in our community, that you can simply log into Ravelry and upload a pattern, as opposed to other communities that are dominated by a selected few big corporations. And I do feel we really should cherish all this independent diversity, because this is what makes our community strong. And if you find a mistake in a pattern, you can simply log into Ravelry, send the designer a private message, or just document this in a project page, and other people can learn from these mistakes or these documentations. And I think that is just so great. So, room for one more. Here's the last unpopular opinion. Knitting flat and sewing together isn't the end of the world. True. I have a hunch that the issue a lot of knitters have with seaming and weaving in ends is more related to a knowledge gap. Nobody really cared to show them how to do it properly and efficiently, and as a result, the whole process is kinda unsatisfying. regardless, and by the way, I have tutorials for seaming here on my channel, I will hold that a seamed sweater will always fit better than one knitted in one continuous round, especially if you don't have this perfect A-line figure. Short rows and creative increases can circumvent some of the issues. However, these techniques often come with structural issues, specifically noticeable holes and eyelets, fault lines, or bias, or short rows will never be 100% unnoticeable from certain angles. So I feel they are rarely on par with actual seaming. Now please, if you don't like seaming, you don't have to explain yourself in front of me. I'm not the one to tell you which fit you enjoy either. Your hobby, your rules, right? However, I often do catch myself looking at raglan sweaters, especially the Fair Isle yoke kind, and think to myself, man, this would have looked so much better using a different kind of construction, and maybe Intarsia would have been the better option to paint those pictures without puckering to the point that it almost looks like ruffles, and those loosey-goosey floats that end up with loose stitches on the front side. Now please, and this really applies to the rest of this video, thinking such thoughts is okay. Comparing yourself with others in a constructive way is how we grow as humans. But please don't go around shouting your unfiltered critique into people's faces without them asking for your feedback. And even then, always consider that there might be a vast experience gulf. Perfection means something entirely different for me as a knitter with decades of experience compared to someone who is working on their second pot holder. Anyway, I could go on, but I think we covered enough controversial material here for now. So it's over to you. Do you have any more unpopular knitting opinions? Comment below. And if you disagree with me, no problem. Get the conversation started and present your arguments. I am certainly not the last authority on knitting, and I'm certainly not the knitting police. I mainly shared my view here in the hope that my view as a professional knitting content creator, as a knitter with decades of experience, helps you to glean some tips and tricks here and there. Not because I know everything about knitting. As I said before, it's your hobby, your rules. Anyway, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.